Hey folks, Swank Ivy here with another Letters to an Asexual. This is number 57. I'm going to read you a conversation I had some time back with someone on OkCupid. And I would like to specify that this person was one of those curious sorts that some of us will recognize as a person that just kind of thinks that their curiosity gives them the right to ask really uncomfortable, very, very personal, intense questions right from the beginning. And, you know, these are coming from somebody who's a stranger and who has not really asked permission to go that intensely personal, but they seem to think that because you talk about this subject, anything is fair game. But I want to specify that because this person kind of said, well, my question might offend you, so I don't know if I can ask it, and I invited him to go ahead and say what he was wondering, that, you know, that I had opened the gate, that I basically invited him to ask me questions about my genitals, which he did do. So, again, not an outright rude person, but somebody who really didn't understand kind of the boundaries for, you know, talking to another person. It's like you can find less personal ways of asking these questions, and then of course you'll also see that in the conversation he reveals kind of some clear prejudices about what the standard should be and what deviations from the standard mean about us. So this conversation, like I said, happened on OkCupid, and if you've never been on OkCupid, especially lately, less so in the past, but especially lately, the way that the messaging system looks, it kind of looks like a chat window rather than an email window, and I always used it for more of an email conversation. I would have longer communications with people, but sometimes people just would send me one line and expect me to treat it like a real-time conversation, and I generally don't do that, so you'll see evidence of that also in this conversation. So the first question that the person sent me, they said, I've watched quite a few of your videos, rather intriguing. I do have a few questions, as I do find you fascinating. So I said, okay, sure, if you have questions, you're welcome. And he begins. He says, the first one's probably in the gray area of stuff you would ignore. If it's okay, I'd like to ask it. How did you realize you were asexual? Have you ever had sexual relations with a male or female before? I too am a writer, by the way. As far as your a-romance, have you ever felt romance and or love? I'm not talking to you about sex or romance. I've never been friends with an asexual before, so these questions are purely for educational purposes. Hopefully you didn't place me on the proverbial sad chair in which you speak of. And by the way, each of those lines was sent as a separate message, so I kept getting emails over and over again from this. And after I didn't immediately answer them, I guess after a little while, he followed up with this and said, well, I'm sorry I offended you, as that was not my intention. Take care, Swank Ivy. So I eventually found some time to sit down with these questions, and I responded. And I said I wasn't even online to receive any of the messages you sent at the time you sent them. And these messages are not real-time conversation, so I think it's really weird that you preemptively assumed my lack of immediate response meant I must be offended. I wasn't. If you do respond to this, please do afford me some time to respond instead of writing your own meaning into my silence, though I do appreciate that you're respectful about other people's boundaries and you don't want to violate mine. I don't mind if people ask questions as long as they also demonstrate a willingness to look at my educational materials for an introduction, and you seem to have done that. I don't think anything you asked was too out there. How I realized I was asexual, pretty much like anyone realizes their sexual orientation, except it's usually a little more complicated for asexual people since nothing can also mean not yet for a while if you're a late bloomer. For me, it was just nobody seemed attractive, and even though I could like a person as a friend, I never felt a romantic or sexual desire for them. So I just called myself non-sexual and figured if that changed, then I would change what I called myself. It didn't change, so I didn't either. On aromance, I have a few very close people in my life, but the love I feel for them isn't romantic. I find that some people think that means I can't love, but that's not really how I'd describe it. It's just not romantic. These are people I've had very close relationships with for more than 15 years, and we're very devoted to each other, but our relationship isn't romantic, and I don't need it to be for us to feel like it's lifelong. On sexual experience. I've never been interested in sex, but I've kissed a few people, various genders, and had a couple relationships where they wanted to experiment with more intimate stuff. I didn't like any of it, and none of it went as far as something I'd call sex. I've heard a lot of "you don't know until you try it" in high school, but I doubted that I would suddenly love the sex part if I didn't love any of the other parts that people thought were so good. Great to hear you're a writer. I usually have pretty good conversations with other writers on here. We tend to have a lot in common with each other. You don't have match questions answered, though. So he comes back with a response and says, "My apologies, I'm somewhat new to OkCupid, but now I realize that I had speculated more than anything. It showed you were online, but I had not received a response back, so I made a warranted assumption, I suppose. I'm just pondering right now, and I'm trying to understand. Pardon for my ignorance. So, you've had experiences with various genders, but was not aroused? Have you ever tried stimulating your clitoris on your own? Are you familiar with the hypothalamus and its functions? The reasons I ask is I'm still trying to determine whether asexuality is caused by psychological or physiological means. You have regular menstrual cycles, I presume? After viewing some of your videos, I've realized that you're quite popular on YouTube. Also, you have a cute voice." So, I responded with this. "It showed you were online. I think the app shows you're online if you've logged in recently. I don't know when it counts you as not being online anymore. Maybe a session has to expire. All I know is if I sign on for a second, I sometimes get bombarded for hours. Based on your questions, you're coming at the concept of asexuality with the attitude of, so, what's missing? What's wrong or malfunctioning? What didn't she try? What's she overlooking? What's the explanation for what's making her different from most people? If you can kind of ride with me here, I'd appreciate it if you'd look at this a different way. Asexual people don't find people sexually attractive. It's not because they forgot to try pressing their happy buttons, or because a gland in their brain didn't work right, or because they must have hormone problems, or be stunted, or because they have a psychological problem. They just don't really think people are sexy. Or rather, maybe they think people are sexy, but they just don't care. That's it, I promise. It's about as simple and as complicated as anyone else's sexual orientation. A set of circumstances, physical elements, past experiences, attitudes, and desires combined in different ways for different people, and for some of us, that adds up to asexual. It wouldn't be accurate or complete to say, well, people are straight because their hormones make them want to reproduce, and similarly, there's not a single issue that explains asexuality for everyone. I think it's natural to wonder the things you have, but I'm also trying to spread awareness to the willing about how we'd like to be viewed. We're trying to push the understanding that for about 1 in every 100 people, not being attracted to anyone is just how we are. Beyond that, people don't get diagnosed straight or gay by a doctor, and they usually don't feel obligated to methodically test every hypothesis and take medical tests to make sure something isn't off. Obviously, you can have a sickness that will affect your perception of sexuality, or your libido, or your sexual performance, but these generally have other symptoms as well. It's just actually not that weird to be asexual. And while some people in our community do have other conditions, or psychological/experiential aspects that may contribute to how they view sex and willingness to engage in it, that's actually true for everyone. but there are certainly scientific investigations that are worth carrying out on people of any sexual orientation, and asexual people have not been exempt. There are several dozen studies about asexuality. A few of them do approach physical aspects and are devoted to measuring people's sexual responses or comparing their hormone measurements with what's typical. We generally aren't physically different from typical people on any unusual level. Our incidences of hormone irregularities, intersex variations, and comorbidity with mental illness or trauma are comparable to those of the typical population, though we sometimes have more issues with depression and anxiety on the same levels as the LGBT and T populations, depending if we live in an environment that has pressured us or made us feel broken or marginalized. If you're interested in what scientific research has been done on asexual people, here's a pretty good list, and I linked them. One study called Physiological and Subjective Sexual Arousal in Self-Identified Asexual Women focused on arousal experiences and shares measurable data, and Anthony Bogart's Asexuality, Dysfunction or Variation concludes that there is no reason to view asexuality as a dysfunction. Bogart has also written the only full asexuality-specific textbook, and Andrew Hinderleiter's How is Asexuality Different from Hypoactive Sexual Desire Disorder examines how a disorder associated with not wanting sex is distinct from a sexual orientation of not experiencing sexual attraction. I hope this didn't sound like a bunch of science babble. It's just that bringing up the hypothalamus and asking me whether I knew what it does suggests to me that you're interested in the medical/experimental side of what asexuality is, so I assume I'm speaking your language. Ignore me if I'm not. Regarding my popularity on YouTube, yeah, you could say that. I reached 5,000 subscribers not too long ago, which I thought is a pretty respectable milestone for such a niche subject. I'm glad you like my voice. I thought about getting into voice acting once upon a time. So he responds again and says, "What I found intriguing is that asexual people can enjoy sex but do not desire it. It took me a second to analyze that sentence. You probably would be good at it if you tried. But again, you have no desire, and I respect that. One thing I must say, though, is you looked so cute in one of your YouTube videos pretending to be flirtatious/sexual. Okay, enough about sex, or should I say, lack thereof, lol. What do you like to do for fun?" So I said this. Some asexual people can enjoy sex, sure, and some asexual people can't or won't. For a lot of us, not being sexually attracted to a partner can be as unappealing as, say, a straight man not being attracted to another man but still having sex with him. For a lot of straight men, having sex with another man would be completely out of the question. That's how it is for a lot of us, too, except we live in a society that expects us to do it and shames us as selfish if we won't. But then there are some, a minority, that don't really mind it or might even actively like it because their feelings about sex don't have to be connected to their feelings about the person they're having it with. Not really my business, though. I'm not one of them. Really not into talking about whether I'd be good at sex, or how cute you think I look pretending not to be asexual. I don't know which one that is. Maybe shit people say to asexuals where we all pretended not to be asexual. And though I'm happy to talk about what I do for fun, I did write a lot in my profile about exactly that. So if you have something to bounce off of that you think we have in common or could talk about, that'd be a great place to start. And then he says one more time and says, "I should have been a little more specific. Aside from dinner and a movie, what do you like to do with other people for fun? Unless you make writing a group effort. That's always fun." And I actually didn't answer that because I just felt like a lot of these questions were kind of like jokingly flirting with me. Just every message had something like hint, hint, wink, wink, nudge, nudge in it. And I don't know, I just didn't feel like the person was engaging with me as a whole entity, I guess. I could be wrong, but I don't know, I just didn't feel like the person was really talking to me as a person. So I don't know, maybe I gave up too soon, but sometimes you get these borderline messages where you don't feel like the person did anything that was outright, hey, don't do this kind of category, but at the same time, you just don't really feel like the person is listening all the way, or they're coming to the conversation with beliefs about sexuality that they're not leaving at the door when they come into the conversation. So there's my example of that kind of conversation, which it's so hard to have those conversations sometimes because you want to be open, you want to be an activist, you want to be able to bring people in and help them learn, but then sometimes they just tax your resources and they don't do enough of the searching themselves, I guess. I mean, for somebody that seemed really interested in the scientific aspect of it, they seem to have done no research on what's already been dug up in studies. And I don't know, watching a bunch of my YouTube videos and coming back with the takeaway like, you got a cute voice, what do you do for fun? You know, it's like, I just don't feel like this is a conversation I want to continue. So let me see, when was this conversation? Looks like I saved that in August 2016. So, I mean, that was a good while ago. Yeah, that was a good while ago, and I still get questions like these. I still get conversations that I just don't really know what to do with. And, you know, at that time there was less research out there to find, but it was definitely out there. I had my book published since, you know, a couple years before that, and you know, when I was doing my research for my book, all I had to do was ask a question in Google, and I found lots of perspectives from people and scientific research as well as personal perspectives. And it just seems like a lot of the time, you know, when somebody asks me, hey, have you played with your clitoris? And do you know what a hypothalamus is? I'm like, I mean, you know, you're talking to somebody who has done a lot of research, right? I mean, how come you're not doing this research if you're actually curious about these things versus just wanting me to explain them to you? So, I don't know, sometimes you just kind of get weary of having the conversations that that don't bring enough of their own research to the table, I guess. And some of them feel like, okay, this is a good conversation topic, this is something we both have an interest in, but I feel more like I'm getting interviewed, and you know, I don't really want to explain the whole thing to you when you're asking these questions. You know, I'd rather just kind of point you to a place where you can read more about it, and if you want to talk to me about something where you're not like looking for information and I'm providing you the information. Like, we can have a back and forth about something, you know, like, I mean, my experiences with other people living in the world as an asexual person, I have a lot of stories, and some of them lead to conversations where I'll volunteer those things. You don't have to even ask me. But this was not one of those conversations where I really felt like I was getting anything out of it. So maybe that's where I start to draw the line these days. Anyway, so I'm obviously pretty tired. Oh, gosh. I'm yawning on film again. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and end this video. I'll see y'all next time, okay?